The Vandals, the people who gave the world a word. Their name became a word for mindless destruction. Every broken window, every spray-painted wall, every act of senseless damage bears their legacy in language. But here is what history actually shows. When the Vandals sacked Rome in 455 AD, they spent 14 days systematically removing its treasures and killed almost no one. Compared to what Rome had done to Carthage 600 years earlier, it barely registered as violence. These were the people who crossed 3 countries in 20 years, built a Mediterranean naval empire from scratch, and created one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the post-Roman world. So who were the Vandals really? How did a Germanic tribe from Scandinavia end up ruling North Africa? And why did history decide to remember them as the villains? Every people has a beginning, and the beginning of the Vandals is a place most people would never associate with North Africa, the Mediterranean, or the sack of Rome. It is the cold, forested north of Europe, the region that is now Scandinavia, specifically the areas that correspond to modern Norway and Sweden, where archaeological and linguistic evidence places the earliest identifiable Vandal presence. From there, over centuries of gradual movement, this Germanic people would make one of the longest and most dramatic migrations in the history of the ancient world, ending up, impossibly, on the southern shore of the Mediterranean, rulers of a naval empire that the Romans hadn't seen coming. The ancient world knew almost nothing specific about the Vandals in their earliest phase. Roman writers mention them occasionally as a group somewhere to the northeast, barbarians of the general Germanic type who were not yet sufficiently threatening to merit detailed description. The name itself, Vandali or Vandilii, appears in Roman sources by the 1st century CE, but without any particularly vivid content. They were one group among many, somewhere in the vast Germanic world that lay beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. What the Vandals were in this early period was a people organized around the same basic structures as most Germanic societies of the time: kinship-based warrior groups, agricultural settlements, a culture that valued personal courage, loyalty to one's lord, and the reciprocal obligations of the warrior band. They worshipped the Germanic gods, Wotan, Tiwaz, the divine powers of the northern tradition, and they understood the world in terms of fate, honor, and the heroic choices that defined a person's legacy. These were not sophisticated theological concepts. They were the practical values of people living in a world where violence was common and survival required both personal toughness and reliable social bonds. The gradual movement of the Vandals southward and eastward over the 1st and 2nd centuries CE brought them into the broader zone of Germanic peoples pressing against the Roman frontier. By the 3rd century CE, the Vandals appear in Roman sources as a significant presence in the region of what is now Poland, Silesia, and Hungary, the broad zone between the Roman Danube frontier and the deeper Germanic interior. Their interactions with Rome during this period were the full spectrum of possibilities: trade, diplomacy, occasional military conflict, and the complex arrangements by which Germanic groups sometimes served in Roman armies or settled within Roman territory as foederati. The division of the Vandals into 2 main groups, the Hasdingi and the Silingi, reflects either an original distinction between 2 related but distinct tribal groups or a division that developed over the course of the migration period. The Hasdingi would prove the more significant of the 2, eventually absorbing or outlasting the Silingi and forming the core of the Vandal Kingdom that would eventually establish itself in North Africa. The Silingi, who had settled in the Iberian province of Baetica, roughly modern Andalusia, were effectively destroyed by a Visigothic military action conducted at Roman request in the early 5th century, leaving the Hasdingi as the primary carriers of Vandal identity. The question of what drove the Vandals' migrations, pushing them ever further from their northern origins, does not have a single, simple answer. Population pressure, climatic deterioration, competition from neighboring groups, the magnetic pull of the wealthier, more productive Roman world to the south. All of these played roles at different times in the long sequence of movement that eventually brought the Vandals from Scandinavia to the shores of the Mediterranean. But the immediate catalyst for the most dramatic phase of their migration, the crossing of the Rhine in December of 406 CE, was the pressure from the east that the arrival of the Huns had set in motion across the entire Germanic world. What made the Vandals distinctive among the many Germanic peoples of the migration era was not some unique quality of their culture or their military capability. In their early phases, they were broadly similar to dozens of other Germanic groups. What made them distinctive was the extraordinary sequence of choices and circumstances that carried them further and into more unfamiliar territory than almost any other people of their time. Most Germanic groups that crossed the Rhine in 406 CE eventually settled somewhere in the western Roman provinces and stayed there. The Vandals kept moving, from Gaul to Spain, from Spain to Africa, and in Africa they found not just a temporary refuge, but the raw materials for an empire. The winter of 406 to 407 CE was a turning point in the history of the Western Roman Empire, though no one who lived through it could have known that at the time. In late December of 406 CE, tradition says the Rhine froze solid, allowing easy crossing, though some scholars dispute the details. A massive movement of Germanic peoples crossed the river into Roman Gaul. Among them were the Vandals, both Hasdingi and Silingi, along with Alans, Suebi, and various other groups. The Roman frontier, which had held for centuries as the boundary between the Roman world and the barbarian world beyond, was breached not by military invasion in the traditional sense, but by the sheer weight of population in motion. The immediate cause was the Hunnic expansion from the east. The Huns, Central Asian nomadic warriors of extraordinary military capability, had appeared on the edges of the Germanic world in the 370s CE and had rapidly destabilized the existing order. Germanic peoples that had maintained rough equilibrium for generations were suddenly under pressure from enemies they could not effectively resist. The Goths, the Vandals, the Alans, all were being pushed westward and southward by the Hunnic advance, into territory that was already occupied by other peoples, until the only direction left was into the Roman Empire itself. The Vandals' experience in Gaul after crossing the Rhine was not the triumphant march of conquerors, but the desperate scrambling of refugees in a hostile landscape. Gaul's Roman population was not welcoming. The Roman military, stretched and distracted as it was, attempted to respond. The various Germanic groups that had crossed together were not a unified force, but a collection of peoples with different destinations and different interests, sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing with each other for the same resources. The 3 years the Vandals spent in Gaul before crossing the Pyrenees into Iberia were years of constant movement, conflict, and uncertainty. The crossing into Iberia in 409 CE opened a new phase. The Iberian Peninsula, with its substantial Roman provincial civilization, its agricultural wealth, and its relative distance from the immediate centers of Roman military power, offered the possibility of something the Vandals had not had for years: a place to stop. The Hasdingi Vandals settled in the northwestern province of Galatia, roughly modern Galicia and Portugal. The Silingi settled in Baetica in the south. The Alans and Suebi settled in other regions. For a brief period, it seemed that the Germanic peoples who had crossed the Rhine might find permanent homes in the western provinces. It was not to be, at least not in Iberia. The Gothic military operations that destroyed the Silingi Vandals in Baetica around 418 CE demonstrated that the Vandals' position in Iberia was not secure. The surviving Silingi were absorbed into the Hasdingi, and the combined group found itself under pressure. The man who responded to this crisis and transformed it from a potential catastrophe into the foundation of an empire was Genseric, the king who would come to dominate the next 50 years of Vandal and Mediterranean history. Under his leadership, the Vandals would make one more dramatic move: across the narrow strait at Gibraltar, into North Africa, into the richest province in the Western Roman Empire. The social organization of the Vandal migration force was built around the warrior household, the extended family group centered on a fighting man, his horses, his weapons, his dependents, and his obligations to the larger group. Women and children traveled with the warrior bands, not as passive dependents, but as integral members of the social unit whose labor, skills, and social networks were essential to survival. The wagons that carried household goods across Gaul and Spain were not just transport. They were mobile homes, the physical expression of a people's determination to maintain domestic life in the midst of perpetual displacement. It took extraordinary social cohesion to keep such a people moving together through decades of hardship without fragmenting into desperate competing bands. One of the most consequential facts about the Vandals, one that shaped their relationship with the Roman populations they ruled and with the Eastern Roman Empire that eventually destroyed them, was their Christian faith. Not the Orthodox Catholic Christianity that the Roman Empire had officially adopted under Constantine and that had become the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world, but a version of Christianity that had been declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, Arianism. The Arian controversy was, at its core, a theological dispute about the nature of Christ. Orthodox Christianity, the position defined at Nicaea, held that Christ was of the same substance as God the Father, fully divine, co-eternal, one person of a Trinity. Arianism, following the theology of the Alexandrian priest Arius, held that Christ was the highest of created beings, subordinate to God the Father, divine but not co-equal. The difference may seem abstract and technical to modern ears, but in the 4th and 5th centuries it was a matter of intense, sometimes violent controversy that divided the Christian world. The Germanic peoples, including the Goths and the Vandals, had been converted to Christianity by missionaries who were themselves Arian, most notably the Gothic bishop Wulfila, who had translated the Bible into Gothic in the 4th century. Wulfila's conversion mission was conducted under Arian emperors in Constantinople, and the Christianity he transmitted to the Gothic and subsequently to the Vandal peoples was the Arian version. By the time the Germanic peoples were crossing Roman frontiers in large numbers, they were already Christian, but the wrong kind of Christian in the eyes of Rome's Catholic establishment. The practical consequences of Arian Christianity for the Vandals in North Africa were significant and largely negative for the empire they had conquered. The Vandal kings, from Genseric onward, treated the Catholic Church of North Africa with a hostility that ranged from administrative discrimination to active persecution. Catholic bishops and clergy were periodically exiled, church property was confiscated, and Catholic religious practice was restricted in ways that generated enormous resentment among the Roman provincial population. This religious conflict was not simply theological stubbornness on the Vandals' part. It was also a political calculation. The Catholic Church was the institution most closely identified with Roman imperial authority and with the loyalties of the conquered Roman population. Restricting Catholic institutional power was, from the Vandal perspective, a way of preventing the Church from serving as an organizational center for resistance to Vandal rule. The calculation was understandable but counterproductive. It ensured that the Roman provincial population never fully reconciled itself to Vandal rule, and that the Catholic Church remained a focus of loyalty to an alternative political order throughout the Vandal Kingdom's existence. The Vandals' Arianism also made them enemies of the Eastern Roman Empire in a way that purely political or military rivalry might not have done. The Emperor Justinian, who would eventually authorize the military campaign that destroyed the Vandal Kingdom, was a man of genuine theological conviction, who understood the reconquest of the Western provinces partly in terms of restoring Catholic orthodoxy. The religious difference was not the only reason for the Byzantine intervention, but it was a genuine factor in making that. Intervention seemed, to its architects, not merely politically but morally justified. The Vandals began as a Germanic people of the interior forests and plains, warriors on horseback and on foot, with no particular naval tradition and no experience of the sea as a medium of power. That they ended up as the dominant naval force in the Western Mediterranean is one of the more remarkable transformations in ancient history, and understanding how it happened tells us a great deal about both the Vandals' adaptability and the specific political and geographic circumstances that made it possible. The North African province that the Vandals occupied after 429 CE was the most economically productive region of the Western Roman Empire. Its agricultural surplus, grain, olive oil, processed foods, fed Rome and other Western cities. Its ports, Carthage above all, but also dozens of smaller harbours along the African coast, were connected to the broader Mediterranean commercial network in ways that had been functioning for centuries. The Vandals, in taking over this province, took over a maritime infrastructure that was already in place and already functioning. Genseric, the Vandal king who led the crossing into Africa and ruled for nearly 50 years, understood with remarkable clarity what this maritime inheritance meant and how it could be exploited. Rather than simply maintaining the existing commercial maritime activity for its economic value, he transformed it into a military and political tool. Vandal fleets began raiding the islands and coastlines of the Western Mediterranean: Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the coasts of southern Gaul and Spain. The raids were not random piracy, but strategic operations, disrupting Roman commerce, demonstrating Vandal military reach, and accumulating the wealth that sustained the kingdom. The technical transition from being passengers on existing vessels to being effective naval operators required training, adaptation, and the absorption of existing maritime expertise. The Vandals accomplished this partly by incorporating North African sailors and shipbuilders into their military forces, and partly through the practical experience of repeated naval operations over decades. By the 450s CE, Vandal fleets were capable of operations across the entire Western Mediterranean, and Genseric's naval power was a factor that every political player in the region had to take into account. The capture of Carthage in 439 CE, achieved by surprise, in violation of a treaty that had given the Vandals the western provinces of North Africa, was the turning point that gave the Vandal Kingdom genuine strategic depth. Carthage was not just the largest city in the Western Mediterranean outside Rome itself, it was the greatest harbour in the Mediterranean world. A port complex built over centuries to handle the enormous grain trade of North Africa. Control of Carthage gave Genseric both the infrastructure for large-scale naval operations and the commercial revenues that paid for them. The islands of the central Mediterranean, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, fell to Vandal control in the years that followed, giving the kingdom a naval-based system that allowed operations across the entire Western Sea. The Vandals had transformed the Mediterranean, which Rome had for centuries called Mare Nostrum, our sea, into something more contested and more dangerous for Roman shipping than it had been in living memory. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II reportedly said, on hearing of Vandal naval activity, that his greatest fear was not any land enemy, but Genseric and his ships. The wealth that sustained the Vandal Kingdom and gave its rulers the means to build fleets, maintain armies, and live in the luxury that contemporary sources describe came primarily from one source: the agricultural productivity of North Africa and the commercial networks that moved its products across the Mediterranean world. The Vandals had not created this productive system. They had inherited it from the Roman provincial administration they displaced. But they managed it well enough to sustain and even expand the economic activity that was its foundation. North Africa in the 5th century CE was the breadbasket of the Western Mediterranean. The wheat fields of what is now Tunisia and northern Algeria produced grain surpluses that had been feeding Rome and other Western cities for centuries. The olive groves produced oil that was not just a food commodity, but the ancient equivalent of a petroleum product: fuel for lamps, lubricant for machinery, base for cosmetics and medicines, and a luxury export that commanded high prices across the Mediterranean world. Processed fish products, garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup of the ancient Mediterranean, were another major North African export. The Vandal economic system maintained the large agricultural estates, the latifundia, that had been the foundation of North African productivity under Roman rule. The main change was in ownership. Vandal nobles and military commanders replaced the Roman senatorial aristocracy as the owners of the most productive land, following a redistribution that Genseric organized in the early years of the kingdom. Roman estate owners were either expelled from their properties, which were given to Vandal warriors as reward for service, or they retained their lands in exchange for cooperation with the new regime. The city of Carthage, the Vandal Kingdom's capital, was the commercial hub through which most of this economic activity was organized. Its harbor handled the grain ships that still, despite changed political circumstances, carried North African produce across the Mediterranean. Its markets attracted merchants from across the former Roman world. Its mint produced the coins, bearing the image of the Vandal king, that served as the currency of the kingdom's commerce. Contemporary sources describe the Vandal elite in Carthage living lives of considerable luxury, inhabiting the grand Roman villas and palaces that the expelled Roman aristocracy had built, attending the baths and circuses that Roman urban culture had established, enjoying the theatrical and musical entertainments of a Roman provincial city. The Vandals, often portrayed as uncultured destroyers, were in fact enthusiastic consumers of Roman luxury culture. They had fought their way across 3 countries to reach North Africa, partly because they wanted access to exactly this kind of civilized prosperity. The trading connections that Carthage maintained with the Eastern Mediterranean, with Constantinople, with Alexandria, with the Syrian and Palestinian ports, meant that the Vandal kingdom was not economically isolated, despite its political conflict with the Eastern Roman Empire. Commercial interests regularly overrode political tensions, and Vandal ships carried North African grain to Eastern ports, even during periods of diplomatic hostility. The economic interdependence of the Mediterranean world was robust enough to survive most of the political upheavals of the 5th century. The Vandal kingdom also profited significantly from the slave trade. Military raids on Sicily, Sardinia, the Italian coasts, and the Aegean islands produced captives who could be sold into slavery through the well-established North African slave markets that had functioned since Carthaginian and Roman times. The captives taken during the sack of Rome in 455 CE, numbering in the thousands according to ancient sources, were not simply ransomed or killed, but were absorbed into the slave economy that underpinned much of the agricultural productivity on which the kingdom depended. It was a brutal dimension of the kingdom's economic life, but one that was entirely typical of the ancient world across all cultures and polities. The creation of a functioning kingdom in North Africa was not something the Vandals had planned or prepared for. When Genseric led his people across the strait from Iberia in 429 CE, the immediate goal was survival and the acquisition of land for a people that had been in motion for over 2 decades. The creation of a politically organized, administratively functional state from the materials at hand, a Germanic warrior people with no experience of complex governance superimposed on a sophisticated Roman provincial society, required improvisation, adaptability, and political intelligence of a high order. Genseric was the man who provided all three. His nearly 50-year reign, from approximately 428 to 477 CE, was one of the longest and most consequential in the history of the late antique world. And his achievements in building and sustaining the Vandal Kingdom deserve far more recognition than they typically receive from histories that focus on the sack of Rome, rather than on the administrative and political work that sustained the kingdom for a century. The fundamental challenge of Vandal governance in North Africa was managing the relationship between the conquering minority, the Vandals themselves, who probably never numbered more than 80,000 people, including women and children, in a province with a Roman and Berber population of several million, and the conquered majority. The Vandals could not rule by sheer numbers. They could not replace the Roman administrative and economic structures that sustained the province. They needed those structures to function and generate the revenues that paid for military power. What they could do was maintain military supremacy while delegating most of the actual work of administration to Roman provincial officials who knew what they were doing. The formal structure of the Vandal Kingdom was a monarchy, with the king holding supreme authority over both military and civil affairs. The great noble families, the Vandal warrior aristocracy that had formed the core of the migration and the conquest, held land granted by royal authority and provided military service in exchange. This was the same basic feudal bargain that Germanic kingdoms across the former Western Roman Empire were working out during this period, the structure that would eventually evolve into medieval European feudalism. The legal system of the Vandal Kingdom was dual. Vandals were governed by Vandal customary law, while the Roman provincial population was governed by modified Roman law. This legal dualism was an accommodation to the practical reality that two very different legal cultures existed within the same political space, and that trying to impose one on the other would have created more problems than it solved. The Roman provinces had legal professionals, trained in Roman law, who continued to function as judges and administrators under Vandal rule. Their expertise was too valuable to discard. The formal recognition of the Vandal Kingdom by the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III in 442 CE, a treaty that acknowledged Vandal control of the richest North African provinces in exchange for a nominal return of some territory, was a political achievement of the first order. The empire that the Vandals had been fighting and raiding for decades was formally acknowledging their legitimacy. Genseric had transformed his people from migrants and raiders into a recognized political entity with treaty rights and legal standing. The man who had crossed from Iberia with a people in desperate motion had created a state. The military history of the Vandals is a story of almost continuous movement and conflict spanning nearly a century, from the Rhine crossing in 406 CE through the consolidation of the North African kingdom in the 440s. Each phase of this military history demonstrates different aspects of Vandal military capability, and the arc from the desperate Rhine crossing to the dominance of the Western Mediterranean shows a people that learned and adapted with remarkable effectiveness. The crossing of the Rhine in December 406 CE was not a military operation in the conventional sense. It was a mass movement of people under pressure. What followed in Gaul was guerrilla raiding and opportunistic pillaging as the Vandals and their allied groups moved through the province, unable to hold territory, but capable of surviving through constant movement and living off the land. The Roman military in Gaul was sufficiently weakened, distracted by political crises in Italy and overstretched across too much frontier, to prevent the Germanic groups from being stopped, but not weakened enough to simply yield territory. The Iberian phase, beginning with the crossing of the Pyrenees in 409 CE, was a more settled period, but still involved constant conflict, with the Roman provincial administration, with other Germanic groups competing for the same territory, and with the Gothic federates, whom Rome used as proxies against the Germanic settlers. The destruction of the Silingi Vandals by Gothic forces around 418 CE was a devastating reminder of the Vandals' vulnerability in Iberia and a major factor in Genseric's calculation that North Africa offered a more defensible and more sustainable home. The crossing to North Africa in 429 CE was Genseric's greatest gamble and greatest achievement. With approximately 80,000 people, warriors, women, children, slaves, and allied groups made the crossing, reportedly guided by Count Boniface, a Roman military commander who had invited Vandal assistance in a political dispute with the imperial court and then found himself unable to send them back. The details of this invitation remain historically controversial, but the practical result was clear. Genseric established a beachhead in North Africa and spent the next decade expanding it against the resistance of the remaining Roman forces in the region. The siege and capture of Carthage in 439 CE was the culmination of the North African campaign. The city had been the administrative and commercial capital of Roman Africa for centuries, and its fall was a shock to the Roman world, comparable in symbolic importance, if not in immediate military consequence, to the sack of Rome itself. Genseric had accomplished in 10 years what would have seemed impossible when he crossed from Iberia. He was now the ruler of the most valuable province in the Western Roman world. The subsequent naval campaigns, the raids on Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and ultimately the sack of Rome in 455 CE, were extensions of this military success onto the sea, exploiting the naval infrastructure that Carthage provided and the political opportunities that the Western Empire's continuing dysfunction created. The Vandal military had transformed over the course of this history from a Germanic land force into a combined maritime and cavalry power capable of projecting force across the Mediterranean. The transformation was not the result of any single decision or any formal military reorganization. It was the result of decades of adaptation to changing strategic circumstances. The image of the Vandals as uncultured destroyers is so deeply embedded in historical memory, in the very word vandalism, that it is difficult for most people to accept what the historical and archaeological evidence actually shows. That the Vandal Kingdom of North Africa was, for much of its century of existence, a relatively prosperous, culturally sophisticated, and administratively functional state that maintained, and in some respects, enhanced the Roman civilization it had inherited. The Vandal court at Carthage was a genuinely cultured environment. The Vandal kings and nobles lived in the grand villas and palaces of the former Roman aristocracy. They attended the Roman baths, which continued to function throughout the Vandal period. They patronized the circuses and theatrical performances that had been central to Roman urban entertainment culture. They spoke Latin. The language of the conquered population had become the language of the court and administration. Contemporary Latin writers who lived under Vandal rule describe a society in which Roman cultural life continued with relatively modest disruption. The Latin literature produced in the Vandal period is an underappreciated body of work. Writers like Dracontius, a North African Latin poet who lived under Vandal rule in the late 5th century, produced poetry of genuine quality and classical learning that demonstrates the survival of Roman literary education and tradition. Fulgentius, another North African writer of the period, produced philosophical and allegorical works that draw on the full range of classical learning. The fact that such writers existed and could find audiences for their work under Vandal rule tells us something important about the cultural reality of the kingdom. The archaeological record of Vandal North Africa shows continued use and maintenance of Roman urban infrastructure. The great baths, the amphitheatres, the aqueducts, the road network, rather than the abandonment and decay that a regime of mere plunderers would have produced. The mosaics of North Africa from the Vandal period are among the finest late antique examples of the form, depicting hunting scenes, mythological subjects, and daily life, with the technical skill and compositional sophistication of the best Roman work. These are not the products of a barbarian culture crushing a civilized one. They are the products of a cultural synthesis. The islands controlled by the Vandal Kingdom, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balearics, were administered rather than merely pillaged. Local populations continued their agricultural activities, paid taxes to the Vandal treasury, and lived under governance that was, for most people, most of the time, distinguishable from Roman provincial administration, mainly in the identity of the officials collecting the taxes. The Vandal Kingdom was not a Roman province, but it was a recognizable successor to Roman provincial governance in a way that its reputation does not suggest. Control of the grain trade that connected North Africa to the rest of the Mediterranean gave the Vandal Kingdom economic power that translated into political influence well beyond what the kingdom's military strength alone could have sustained. The Roman city of Rome itself, which in the 5th century still had a population of several 100,000 people who needed to be fed, was dependent on North African grain. This dependency gave Genseric leverage over Roman politics that he used with considerable skill, intervening in Roman succession disputes and diplomatic arrangements in ways that affected the course of Western Roman political history. The Vandal Kingdom produced remarkably few individuals who are known by name to history, a consequence of the sparse sources for this period and the kingdom's relative obscurity in the grand narrative of the ancient world. But two kings stand out as figures of genuine historical significance: Genseric, who built the kingdom and gave it its character, and Gelimer, who fought to the end to defend what Genseric had created and ultimately failed. Genseric is one of the most underrated political and military leaders in late antique history. He ruled the Vandals for nearly 50 years, from approximately 428 to 477 CE, and during that time transformed his people from desperate migrants into rulers of a Mediterranean maritime empire. He crossed from Iberia to Africa with 80,000 people and no fixed destination. He captured Carthage and made it the capital of a new kingdom. He sacked Rome and walked away with its treasures. He defeated Roman and Byzantine naval expeditions sent to destroy him. He negotiated treaties that gave his kingdom legal standing in the Roman world. He outlasted 3 Western Roman emperors and left his kingdom to his successors in a stronger position than it had been in when he took power. The episode of his early life that most reveals his character is also the most mysterious. He was reportedly lame. Some ancient sources suggest he fell from a horse in his youth and never fully recovered. And yet, he dominated a warrior culture that valued physical prowess above almost everything else. To maintain authority over Vandal warriors when you cannot fight effectively in the way that warrior culture demands requires a different kind of leadership. Strategic intelligence, political skill, and the ability to inspire loyalty through means other than personal combat. Genseric had all of these in abundance. His diplomacy was as formidable as his generalship. He maintained useful relationships with multiple parties simultaneously, negotiating with Western Roman emperors while also cultivating relationships with Eastern Roman officials, maintaining commercial ties with Constantinople while raiding its shores, and managing the various Germanic kingdoms of the Western Mediterranean in ways that prevented the formation of coordinated coalitions against him. He was a genuinely formidable diplomatic operator in an era when diplomatic skill was as important as military power for the survival of new kingdoms. The great naval victory of 468 CE, when a massive Byzantine expedition sent by the Emperor Leo I to destroy the Vandal Kingdom was burned by Vandal fireships in one of the most consequential naval battles of late antiquity, was Genseric's greatest military triumph. The Byzantine fleet, reportedly one of the largest assembled in the ancient world, was caught in harbour at Cape Bon and destroyed by Vandal fireships in a night attack of extraordinary boldness. The loss was so catastrophic that the Eastern Empire did not attempt another major naval offensive against the Vandals for 60 years. A man capable of organising an operation of that scale and audacity at the age of approximately 70 is not a figure who should be reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. The sack of Rome in 455 CE, which will receive its full treatment in episode 10, was Genseric's most famous act and the one that most shaped subsequent historical memory of the Vandals. But it was not his most important achievement. His most important achievement was creating the conditions under which the Vandal Kingdom survived for over a century after his death, establishing the administrative structures, the military traditions, and the political relationships that gave his successors a functioning state rather than just a successful raid. Gelimer, who became king in 530 CE, was the last Vandal king and the man who faced the Byzantine reconquest. He came to power by deposing his cousin Hilderic, a king who had maintained friendly relations with Constantinople and relaxed the persecution of the Catholic Church that had characterized earlier Vandal religious policy. Gelimer's coup was a rejection of that accommodating approach and a reassertion of traditional Vandal independence. It also gave Justinian the political justification he needed. The emperor claimed to be intervening to restore the legitimate king Hilderic, whom Gelimer had imprisoned. Gelimer fought the Byzantine forces commanded by Belisarius with courage and tactical intelligence, but he was outmatched. The Vandal military, which had maintained its reputation for over a century on the basis of its naval power and cavalry, found itself facing a Byzantine force that was better organized, better equipped, and commanded by one of the greatest generals of late antiquity. The Battle of Ad Decimum in September 533 CE and the subsequent Battle of Tricomarum in December showed the limits of Vandal military power against a determined and well-resourced opponent. Gelimer fled, was eventually captured, and was taken to Constantinople. His fate, a comfortable retirement on an estate in Galatia, was not without a certain dignity, though the kingdom he had fought to defend was gone. In June of 455 CE, a Vandal fleet appeared off the coast of Italy and landed an army at the mouth of the Tiber River. The city of Rome, still the symbolic capital of the Western world, even though real power had long since migrated elsewhere, lay open before them. The reigning emperor, Petronius Maximus, fled and was killed by his own people in the chaos. There was no military force capable of defending the city. Pope Leo I went out to meet Genseric and negotiate, as Pope Leo I had done with Attila 3 years earlier. Rome's fate was in the hands of its bishop. What happened next has been remembered as the Vandal sack, and the event has given its perpetrator's name to every act of mindless destruction in every language that has borrowed the word from Latin. The historical reality is considerably more nuanced. The Vandals spent 14 days in Rome. During those 14 days, they systematically removed movable wealth, gold and silver objects from palaces and temples, luxury goods from aristocratic homes, treasures that had accumulated in Rome over centuries of empire. They took captives, including the Empress Eudoxia and her daughters, who were brought to Carthage. Eudoxia had reportedly invited Genseric to intervene in Roman politics in the first place, making her capture a somewhat complicated matter. What they did not do is what makes the 455 sack historically distinctive. They did not burn the city. They did not conduct mass killings of the civilian population. They did not destroy the major monuments, the great buildings, the physical infrastructure of the city. The churches, which Pope Leo had reportedly negotiated to protect, were not plundered. The population that had not fled before the arrival of the Vandals survived the occupation and found their city largely intact, minus its portable treasures, when the Vandal fleet departed. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources note the relative restraint of the Vandal sack compared to what Roman armies had typically done to conquered cities. The sack of Jerusalem by Titus in 70 CE had resulted in the city's destruction and the massacre or enslavement of much of its population. The sack of Carthage by Rome in 146 BCE, which resulted in the city's total demolition and the enslavement of its entire surviving population, was a standard by which Genseric's treatment of Rome looks almost gentle. Among the treasures removed from Rome was a particularly significant collection. The objects that Titus had taken from the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE and that had been displayed in Rome ever since. The menorah, the table of showbread, the silver trumpets, the sacred instruments of the Jerusalem temple, had sat in Rome for nearly 4 centuries. Genseric took them to Carthage, where they remained until the Byzantine conquest of 533 CE, when Belisarius took them to Constantinople. Their subsequent fate is uncertain. Some traditions say they were eventually returned to Jerusalem, others that they disappeared into the Byzantine imperial treasury. The sack's historical legacy is disproportionate to its actual destructive impact, and that disproportion tells us something important about how historical memory works. Rome in 455 CE was no longer the political center of the empire, and its physical destruction was not what the sack represented. What it represented was the symbolic humiliation of the city that had been the center of the known world. The city that had sacked Carthage, the city that had conquered the entire Mediterranean, the city before which everyone was supposed to bow. That the Vandals, descendants of people who had lived beyond Rome's northern frontier, could walk into Rome and take whatever they wanted, was a statement about the collapse of Roman power that no battle could have made more clearly. The internal life of the Vandal Kingdom, the day-to-day reality of governance, social organization, and religious conflict, is less dramatic than the great military events that defined its external history, but equally important for understanding what the kingdom actually was and why it eventually proved fragile when tested. The wealth of the kingdom was concentrated in the Vandal aristocracy, the military families who had received land grants in the initial redistribution of North African estates that Genseric organized after the conquest. This aristocracy lived in genuine luxury by any ancient standard. The great estates they had taken from expelled Roman landowners were productive agricultural enterprises managed by the same labor force, enslaved workers and dependent tenant farmers, that had managed them under Roman ownership. The income from these estates supported aristocratic households that maintained large retinues, patronized craftsmen, and consumed the luxury goods that continued to flow through Carthage's commercial networks. The religious conflict between Vandal Arians and the Catholic majority of the North African population was the most persistent source of internal tension in the kingdom. Vandal religious policy was not consistently oppressive. It fluctuated significantly between individual reigns, with some kings pursuing more aggressive anti-Catholic policies and others, like the later King Genseric, taking a more accommodating approach. But even during the relatively tolerant periods, the structural reality was that the religion of the majority population was restricted in institutional terms. Catholic bishops could be exiled, Catholic church property could be confiscated, and Catholic advancement in royal service was limited. The Catholic Church in North Africa maintained its institutional integrity throughout the Vandal period, partly because the Vandals never found a way to fully suppress it, and partly because doing so would have disrupted the social fabric of the province in ways that even the most militantly Arian king could see were counterproductive. The great African theologians, inheritors of the tradition of Augustine, who had died in Hippo as the Vandals were besieging the city in 430 CE, continued to write, think, and organize even under conditions of intermittent persecution. The intelligence and security apparatus of the Vandal Kingdom was less sophisticated than that of either Rome or Byzantium, but it existed. The kings were aware of the possibility of Catholic organized resistance and periodically conducted purges of suspected conspirators. The nobility, whose loyalty was maintained through land grants and royal favor, was monitored for signs of ambition that might threaten royal authority. The history of the Vandal Kingdom is punctuated by episodes of violent dynastic conflict, murders, depositions, and coups that suggest a court environment of genuine danger for those who sought or held power. The question of succession was a persistent source of instability. Genseric had attempted to address this by establishing a rule that the kingship should pass to the oldest male member of the Vandal royal family, a rule intended to prevent the fratricidal conflicts over succession that plagued many Germanic kingdoms. The rule was rational in theory, but difficult to enforce in practice when the oldest male member of the royal family was not the king's preferred successor. The later history of the kingdom is marked by succession disputes that weakened the central authority precisely when strong leadership was most needed. The context in which the Vandal kingdom found itself in the early 6th century CE was fundamentally different from the context in which Genseric had built it in the mid-5th century. The political landscape of the Mediterranean world had been reshaped by the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, and by the emergence of a more assertive, more competent Eastern Roman administration under the Emperor Justinian I, who came to power in 527 CE with a vision of restoring the full Roman Empire to its former extent. Justinian was one of the most energetic and ambitious emperors in Roman history. He reformed Roman law, producing the Corpus Juris Civilis that remains the foundation of legal systems across much of the world today. He built the Hagia Sophia and dozens of other major architectural projects. He maintained a court of remarkable intellectual vitality, and he pursued an aggressive reconquest policy in the Western Mediterranean, beginning with North Africa and the Vandal Kingdom. The Vandal Kingdom that Justinian targeted was weaker than it had been at its peak. The naval superiority that had made Genseric's kingdom so formidable had eroded. The Vandals had not maintained the maritime investment that had made them masters of the Western Sea, and the navy that had raided Sicily and sacked Rome was no longer what it had been. The military culture of the kingdom had softened in ways that contemporary observers noticed. A century of prosperity in North Africa had, in the view of critics, produced a warrior people more interested in the comforts of Roman provincial life than in the martial virtues that had brought their ancestors from the Rhine to Carthage. The climate of North Africa in the 6th century may also have been a factor. Evidence of increased aridity in parts of the Maghreb during this period suggests that the agricultural productivity that had been the economic foundation of the kingdom was under pressure. Droughts that reduced grain yields would have reduced the revenues available for military expenditure at precisely the time when military capability was most needed. The Antonine Plague analogy that had affected the Parthians had its parallel in the Justinianic Plague that struck the Mediterranean world in the 540s CE, after the Vandal Kingdom had already fallen, but whose precursor conditions may have already been creating mortality and economic disruption in the region in the years immediately before the Byzantine invasion. The complex interactions between climate, disease, economic capacity, and military power that characterized the late antique world were working against the Vandal Kingdom in its final decades. The successors of Genseric, who ruled the Vandal Kingdom in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, faced challenges that their great predecessor had not encountered. The challenge of maintaining a warrior culture in conditions of peace and prosperity, and the challenge of governing a stable state when the political dynamics of the court rewarded intrigue over military effectiveness. The criticism that the Vandals had become soft through their adoption of Roman luxury lifestyle appears repeatedly in contemporary sources, most notably in the writings of Procopius, the Byzantine historian who accompanied Belisarius on the North African campaign, and who had an obvious interest in portraying the Vandals as degenerate. His descriptions of Vandal aristocrats spending their days in baths, gardens, and theatrical entertainments rather than in military training are clearly shaped by a narrative purpose. But the kernel of truth they contain is that a people whose identity had been formed by migration and warfare was finding it difficult to maintain that identity in conditions of settled prosperity. The dynastic conflicts that marked the later Vandal Kingdom were not the result of individual moral failures, but of structural problems in the succession system. The rule that Genseric had established, oldest male of the royal family inherits, created problems when the oldest male was not the previous king's son, when disputed genealogical claims created competing legitimate candidates, or when powerful nobles preferred a candidate they could control to a capable candidate they could not. The coups and counter-coups of the late 5th and early 6th centuries consumed political energy that might better have been directed toward maintaining military readiness. The deposition of Hilderic by Gelimer in 530 CE, the event that gave Justinian his casus belli, was a manifestation of these structural problems. Hilderic was a son of Genseric's son, Huneric, and the daughter of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, a king with genuine Roman dynastic connections who had pursued a policy of accommodation with Constantinople and relaxation of anti-Catholic religious pressure. Gelimer and his supporters saw this accommodating policy as a betrayal of Vandal independence. Their coup was a reassertion of traditional Vandal identity against what they perceived as creeping Romanization. The irony is that Gelimer's coup, by providing Justinian with a pretext, accelerated the very outcome it was designed to prevent. A continued Hilderic reign, with its policy of accommodation toward Constantinople, might have maintained the Vandal Kingdom as a Byzantine client state indefinitely. Gelimer's reassertion of independence invited the Byzantine military response that Hilderic's accommodationism had been designed to avoid. The Vandal Kingdom's end came at least partly from its own attempt to preserve itself. In the summer of 533 CE, a Byzantine fleet of nearly 500 ships carrying approximately 15,000 soldiers, sailed from Constantinople toward North Africa. The expedition was commanded by Belisarius, the greatest general of the 6th century, Justinian's most capable military instrument, and the man who would prove that the Vandal Kingdom's century of dominance over the Western Mediterranean could be ended in less than a year. The speed and totality of the Vandal defeat shocked the ancient world as much as it surprises modern students of the period. The Vandal Kingdom had been the dominant military power in the Western Mediterranean for decades. It had defeated Roman and Byzantine naval expeditions before, most spectacularly in 468 CE, when a massive Byzantine fleet sent to destroy Genseric had been burned by Vandal fireships in one of the greatest naval battles of late antiquity. The memory of that victory was part of the Vandal Kingdom's identity, and part of the reason why Vandal military self-confidence remained high going into the campaign. But Belisarius had advantages that previous Byzantine commanders had lacked. He was a tactical genius with extensive experience in mobile warfare, capable of making decisions quickly and exploiting opportunities that slower-thinking opponents missed. He had a disciplined, professional army that included Hunnic cavalry and Gothic infantry alongside Byzantine regulars, a combined arms force of considerable capability. And he faced a Vandal opponent who was distracted by the need to manage a dynastic crisis. A substantial portion of Vandal forces were occupied in Sardinia, suppressing a rebellion, when Belisarius landed in Africa. The Battle of Ad Decimum, fought at the 10th milestone from Carthage on September 13, 533 CE, was the decisive engagement. Belisarius's cavalry caught Gelimer's forces in a situation where the Vandal tactical advantage of speed and mobility was neutralized by the specific terrain and the circumstances of the battle. The Vandal cavalry was broken. Carthage was taken without a siege. Gelimer regrouped his forces and attempted to rally the Vandal nation for a second battle, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The Battle of Tricamarum in December 533 CE was the final Vandal defeat in open battle. Gelimer fled to the mountains of the interior, where he held out for several months among the Berber peoples of the region. His eventual surrender, reportedly precipitated partly by the genuine hardships of mountain refuge, ended armed Vandal resistance. He was taken to Constantinople, where Justinian held a triumph in the traditional Roman manner, with Gelimer walking in chains as the culminating exhibit of Roman victory. The fate of the Vandal people after the conquest was varied, and, in total, the end of their existence as a distinct group. Those captured in battle or surrender were incorporated into the Byzantine military as soldiers, the standard late Roman practice for defeated barbarian peoples. Others were dispersed across the Eastern Empire's territories, their land in North Africa, redistributed to Byzantine landowners and to the Roman provincial population that had lived under Vandal rule for a century. Within a generation, the Vandals had ceased to exist as a recognizable community. The most dramatic migration in late antique history had ended in absorption. The word vandalism is the most enduring monument to the Vandals, a linguistic memorial that has outlasted every physical trace of their kingdom and every document they produced. It is also, as we have seen, a profoundly misleading memorial. The word was coined in the 18th century, not in antiquity, by the French revolutionary bishop Henri Grégoire, who used it in 1794 to describe the deliberate destruction of revolutionary mobs attacking French cultural treasures. He chose vandalism as his term because the Vandals had the reputation, among educated Europeans of his time, of being the archetypal destroyers of civilization. But Gregoire was working from a received reputation rather than a careful historical assessment, and the received reputation was shaped primarily by the hostile accounts of Roman Catholic writers who had suffered under Vandal Arian rule, and who had strong motivations for portraying their oppressors in the worst possible light. The reality of the Vandal sack of Rome, systematic and careful removal of portable wealth, with minimal destruction of the city itself, is actually the opposite of what the word vandalism now means. The Vandals did not mindlessly destroy, they methodically looted. The distinction matters. The geographic legacy of the Vandals is more concrete and more interesting. The region of southern Spain, known as Andalusia, one of the most culturally rich and historically significant regions of Europe, famous for its Moorish architecture, its flamenco music, its olive groves, and its complex layered history, almost certainly takes its name from Vandalusia, the land of the Vandals. The Silingi Vandals, who settled in Baetica in the early 5th century, gave their name to the province they occupied, and that name survived through the centuries of Visigothic and then Islamic rule to become the modern Andalusia. Every time someone mentions Andalusia, in travel, in music, in discussion of Spanish culture, they are unknowingly invoking the Vandals. The archaeological legacy of the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa is substantial but underexplored. The great Roman cities of Tunisia, Carthage, Utica, Bulla Regia, Duga, Spatla, contain layers of Vandal occupation that have been studied less systematically than their Roman and Byzantine layers. The mosaics, the coins, the inscriptions, and the physical remains of buildings from the Vandal period tell a story of cultural continuity and practical governance that contradicts the destructive reputation. The Bardo National Museum in Tunis and the Carthage Museum hold collections that include Vandal period objects demonstrating the sophisticated material culture of the kingdom at its height. The scholarly reassessment of the Vandals that has been underway since the late 20th century has substantially rehabilitated their historical reputation. Historians like Andy Merrills, Richard Miles, and others have produced careful analyses of the Vandal Kingdom that treat it as a serious political and cultural entity, rather than as a footnote to the fall of Rome. The Vandal period in North Africa is now understood as a period of cultural continuity, administrative function, and genuine political achievement, not as a dark age of barbarism between Roman and Byzantine rule. The DNA legacy of the Vandals is difficult to trace precisely because the Vandals were already a genetically diverse group by the time they reached North Africa, and because they were absorbed into the North African, Berber, and ultimately Arab and Amazigh populations without leaving a distinct genetic signature that can be reliably identified. The descendants of the Vandals are everywhere and nowhere. Their genes flowed into the population of North Africa and were carried forward into the populations that succeeded the Vandal Kingdom, contributing to the genetic inheritance of a region that has been home to many peoples over many centuries. The Vandals were not the mindless destroyers that their name suggests. They were a Germanic people who made one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of the ancient world, from the forests of Scandinavia
to the palaces of Carthage, building a Mediterranean empire from the materials they found along the way and maintaining it for over a century against the most powerful opponents available. They were flawed. Their religious intolerance created enemies they needed as allies. Their warrior culture struggled to adapt to the demands of settled governance. Their succession system generated the crises that ultimately gave their enemies the opportunity they needed.